Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 1931 horror film, Dracula. Now, this is one of those films that I definitely did grow up watching, alongside a multitude of other Universal monster movies. I used to check them out all the time on VHS at the local library. I would read novelizations of the Universal Monster movies. I would check out books about the Universal Monsters. As a kid, I was a big fan of the Universal Monsters. I even had a coloring book. So I was super big on these guys. And Dracula was one that I did watch often, but I hadn't seen it in a long time. And I gotta be honest here. As a kid, I could probably get past some of the issues that I have with this film now. But as an adult, and after seeing so many other films and so many other Dracula films or vampire movies, I just can't get past some of this film's faults. It's one of those movies where I respect it immensely. The ground that it paved for the genre of horror is hollowed ground. It's one of those films that I think deserves the utmost respect and appreciation for what it started. It started the Universal Monsters boom. It, in a lot of ways, started the path that horror as a genre is taking today. So it's one of those things where I definitely have a lot of love for the film for that, because I'm a huge fan of the horror genre. It's my favorite genre of film. And while there were other horror films like Lon Chaney's Phantom of the Opera, or Edison's Frankenstein, or some of these other horror movies like Vampire that came out prior to Dracula. Dracula, though, is really the one that started a wildfire, so to speak. It really kick-started the entire genre of horror because it made it more mainstream, it made it really popular, and it led to a lot more horror films and a lot more variety of horror films in the years after its release. So it's a film that I have the utmost appreciation and respect for. That being said, I'm not really that big of a fan of it. There are other Universal monster movies that I enjoy more than Dracula, and I would say that at the end of the day, I like it all right, but it's not a film that I really enjoy or I would really watch over and over again, like some of the other Universal monster movies or other Dracula films. But that's just me personally. The movie is directed by Tod Browning, with some uncredited work by Carl Freund, and the direction for the time, for the 1930s, is great. I'm just gonna say it and put it out there because you have to look at Tod Browning's work in comparison with other films from the time. And when you do that, this is some really standout work by Tod Browning. And it's very evident in a lot of different sequences. The shots at Carfax Abbey, the sequences in the finale in the Abbey, with the rows of coffins and the cobweb stairwells. And one scene in particular that really stood out to me is a shot where Van Helsing has this cigar box, I believe, that has a mirror in the lid. And that's how you know that Dracula is showing no reflection. And the way that that scene is shot is very contemporary. It's very of the time today, where it's shot in what appears to be not necessarily one shot, but it's shot live. And it's shot in a way that is showcasing a angle that really immerses you in the sequence, where the camera will focus on the mirror, and they find a way to still show no reflection in the mirror, and it's a really convincing effect, and it's probably something they did rather simply, but it's one of those things where for 1931 standards to pull off a shot like that, that's really impressive. And I want to give Tod Browning a ton of credit for that. So, yeah, it's a film that for the time has some really good direction in it by Tod Browning. Nice use of angles, nice use of zooms and pans, what little there is, because the movement of the camera was a little more limited around this time period. So, considering the limitations, considering the fact that this is a film that was released in 1931, this has some really solid direction in it. The script by Garrett Fort, based on the novel of Dracula by Bram Stoker, as well as the play by Hamilton Dean and John L. Balderston, really, it says it's based on the novel, but it's really more closely adapted from the stage play. And as a film adaptation of a stage play, the script is fine. I think it has the right amount of beats to it, but there's not a lot going on. And I think that's really honestly one of my biggest problems with this film, is that it's not the fact that it's moves slowly. It's just the fact that there isn't a lot of action, there isn't a lot of intrigue. It's not that interesting of a plot or a screenplay. The fact that it just adapts this stage play pretty much verbatim honestly makes it so the film plays out like a stage play. And a stage play has a very different flow to it when it comes to the narrative and the static nature of a stage play when it comes to how one scene moves to the next is not necessarily that big of a deal or that much of a problem on that particular stage. But when you translate that to film, well, then the limitations start to really show. And I think there are a lot of moments in this film where it just plays out too much like a stage play that's adapted for a movie. And I think the script could have done a little bit better of a job differentiating itself from the stage play. Because, yeah, there's just some moments where it just goes through its beats, it goes through its motions, and it just seems like it's just kind of lazily dragging its feet. It does an all right job starting things off, introducing Dracula and bringing Dracula into the fray, having Renfield be the focus early on at Count Dracula's castle. And of course, this film also has some very iconic lines. You know, I never drink wine. Or just the way Dracula introduces himself to Renfield. Welcome to my abode. Yeah, welcome to Castle Dracula. There's just something so iconic about that. And yeah, Renfield has this encounter with Dracula, and that doesn't end well. Then Dracula winds up getting on the ship, the Vesta, and then goes to England. Renfield is sent to the sanatorium, and then you're introduced to Seward and his daughter Mina and her fiance John Harker and Lucy, and Dracula feasts on Lucy's blood while she sleeps. She dies. Renfield, of course, is obsessed with eating flies and all kinds of bugs. Van Helsing then gets introduced. And then he in a lot of ways, Van Helsing and his dialogue is there to explain the rules of a vampire and what a vampire is and what a vampire does and how you can stop a vampire. And then he and Harker team up to stop Dracula. Renfield gets in the way. Dracula takes him out. And it leads to the climax, which I don't know if this is the way the stage play ended or not. Probably because this is 1931, so you can't really show a lot of violence. See, that's the thing. I'm not going to harp on the fact that it doesn't have as much teeth or as much edge to it, because it's 1931. This is the pre-code era. Like, this is not something that you're going to see. You're not going to see a lot of blood. You're not going to see teeth biting into flesh. You're not going to see gore or anything really that intense. So I'm not going to knock it too much for that. But I think that they could have done a little bit better job with the climax, though. So the climax, I'm not really a big fan of it because it's a bit clunky. So Jonathan and Van Helsing, they go to Carfax Abbey to corner Dracula. Dracula has already taken Mina at this point, and Renfield is there, and Renfield winds up getting killed by Dracula in what is honestly a really effective sequence, because the way that it's written and the way that it's performed by the actors really makes Renfield into a very sympathetic character. But I don't think it really recovers from that emotional barrage, so to speak. Because after that moment, the sequences that play out afterwards really don't have the same emotional weight. And when you get to the scene where Dracula gets staked in the heart, well, because you don't really actually see much, it can be something that at first glance you might miss. I gotta be honest, like, I had seen this film a couple times. Well, actually, no, I'd seen this film multiple times, but it'd been a long time since I had seen it last. And when I rewatched the movie and I got to the point where Dracula dies, I just completely missed what happened. And I interpreted Dracula's death completely different in terms of how it actually is, because I just missed that scene. Because honestly, it's a blink and you miss it kind of sequence, really. It's not one of those things where I wasn't paying attention. It's just, it's so vague and so inconsequential compared to a lot of other moments in the film that it doesn't really leave that much of a lasting impression. I know people have said that because you don't see him get staked in the heart, it's so much scarier, and it leaves it up to your imagination, and it's so much better that way. And to each their own. Like, I think there definitely is something to be said about leaving things up to your imagination, but in this instance, it just feels like things are building up to this point, and you don't really get that satisfying of a climax, especially if you watch the version of the film that doesn't have Dracula's death groan in it. If you watch that version, then you just hear a steak get pounded, and that's about it. and you're just like, okay, what happened? It's like one of those things. Like, I didn't even know it was Van Helsing pounding a steak initially, because you don't really see him grab the steak, point it at Dracula. I'm not expecting, especially for this time period, to see a stake driven into his heart, because that just would have been too intense for 1930s audiences. But maybe a shot of Dracula in the coffin, and like Van Helsing opens the coffin, Dracula's there. Maybe Dracula opens his eyes or something. Van Helsing has the stake and he's raising it up, and then you cut to the sound of the stake being driven into his heart, and Dracula's groan. Just something, because it just felt like the way that the scene was blocked and the way that it was written was just very lackluster. I mean, even for 1930 standards, because if you compare the climax of this, for instance, to the climax of Frankenstein or Bride of Frankenstein or a lot of the other Universal Monsters movies, it's definitely one of those things where it's pretty weak in comparison, pretty anemic. And then after that, Van Helsing talks to Mina, says that the horror is over, Dracula's dead. Mina talks about how Dracula was stopped by the sunlight, which that confused me, because initially, after my most recent rewatch, I thought that that's how Dracula died. He just stumbled into the sunlight and died off screen, but that's not actually the case. So I'm glad that that's not what happened, because then I would like the ending even less. But I guess that's how she was able to get away from him, apparently. And then you have like Van Helsing says something, I've got to stay behind, I've got something to do. And you never figure out what that thing is. And Mina and Jonathan then just go up the stairwell, and then the end. And you're like, okay, now it's over. Like, it just felt like it was an abrupt ending. And yeah, that's why I feel the climax, it's clunky. I'm not a fan of the climax. I think it could have been a lot better in terms of the way that it was structured, the way that it was written, the way that it played out. And that's a big reason why the film, to me, is just pretty okay. Especially when it comes to Dracula films. There are other Dracula films that I like a lot more, like Bram Stoker's Dracula, or Horror of Dracula, or the 1979 Dracula, directed by John Badham. But yeah, script, it's decent. It's a decent enough script, but I think it definitely could have used some improvement. And I think one of the biggest reasons why this film is at least watchable and somewhat entertaining is because of two specific actors. Bela Lugosi as Count Dracula, and Dwight Frye as Renfield. I mean, Bela Lugosi, I mean, this was a instant success when it comes to a role. He just embodied the character for the time perfectly, with the accent and the demeanor and everything. He definitely had a commanding on-screen presence as Dracula, even though you didn't really see him do a lot, because you can't show a lot of violence or a lot of that stuff, because that's just not allowed around this time period. So he still managed to sink his teeth into the audience regardless, and became just an instant favorite with audiences at the time and for many, many years afterwards. Like, for a lot of people, the quintessential Dracula in their minds is still Bela Lugosi. And you could see his influence in a lot of other interpretations of the character. I mean, for instance, Duncan Rager's interpretation of Dracula in the Monster Squad, which I love, in a lot of ways is Bela, but on steroids and with a serious edge. So, yeah, Bela Lugosi was just wonderful as Dracula. Dwight Frye was equally as fun to watch as Renfield, who honestly, to me, he still is the quintessential Renfield. When I think of Renfield, I automatically think of Dwight Frye in this film with his signature laugh, you know. Just a great manic performance by Dwight Frye. The rest of the cast is there. I mean, Edward Van Sloan, I didn't mind as Van Helsing. He had a certain presence to him as well. You definitely did buy that he was a viable foe or threat to Count Dracula. Helen Chandler as Mina and Frances Dade as Lucy. They were serviceable as well, but not anything really that amazing. I think one of the problems that I have with some of these older films is not really the film's fault. It's just the way that acting was back then. And a lot of the performances from female actresses from around this time period are very flighty and very uh, um, theatrical and a little bit too hammy. And I've never really been a big fan of a lot of the performances that I've seen from female actresses around this time period. And that's just because it's the style of acting that they were tasked with performing, and that was the norm, is to act that way. So I can't really criticize their performance that harshly. It's just a personal preference thing. I prefer the style of acting that was a little bit more grounded, a little bit more realistic, that was popularized multiple decades later. But for what they were asked to do, decent enough. David Manners, though, as John Harker, he sucked. He was pretty bad. I did not care for that performance. So, yeah, I mean, cast could be a little bit better, especially when it comes to getting a better actor to play Jonathan Harker. But when you got Bella and you got Dwight Frye, you're in good hands when it comes to the cast. Now, the film also features some cinematography by Carl Freund, who also did some uncredited direction for the film. And this is a really slick looking film for 1931. There's some really wonderful, just gorgeous gothic shots in this film, especially of Castle Dracula or Carfax Abbey, that really are very atmospheric and just create a very eerie, spooky mood. And it also features some decent editing by Milton Carruth and Maurice Pivar for what they were trying to do. Editing at this time in the 1930s was also something that was a emerging thing. Like, it wasn't really what you would see nowadays, where you're not going to see a lot of clever edits. It's not really kind of a thing yet. So film, at least feature length films, they had only really been a thing for, I think, like maybe like 10 years or maybe a little bit longer than that, but not really to the extent where they had really kind of honed things down to the point where they were able to really branch out and really do stuff that was just off the wall and something very unique. So the editing for this is pretty serviceable. It's just kind of there, but that's just the norm for what was going on in 1931. And it's like 75 minutes, so that's another thing that definitely is in the film's favor. It's not really that long. It doesn't get that dull or that boring because it's only 75 minutes, but there are still some parts where it's really slow and there's a lot of dialogue and there's not really a lot happening. So There are some moments where it could still get a little tedious, but that's just one of those things where I think they were just working with the stage play, and that just limited what they were able to do. Also, at the same time, I mean, this is 1931, so there's a lot of stuff that you could not get away with then that you can do now, and despite that, even the little bit that they did show here was still considered to be risque and uh, intense for 1931. Um, so yeah, it's a film that, like I said, I appreciate and I respect immensely, but it's definitely not one of my favorites. It also features, I want to mention the music as well, because there really isn't a lot of music. There isn't really much of a score. Yeah, because no score had ever really been composed specifically for the film. The music heard during the opening credits was an excerpt from Act 2 of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. And during the theater scene where Dracula meets Dr. Seward, Harker, Mina, and Lucy, the end of the overture to Wagner's Die Meister Singer von Nürnberg can be heard, as well as the opening of Schubert's Unfinished Symphony in B minor. But in 1998, Philip Glass worked with the Kronos Quartet and created an actual score for the film. And that is the version that I watched for the most recent viewing. And that is the version that I definitely prefer. The original version with just the little bits of music, I think the issues with the script and with the fact that it's so tightly based on the stage play really become glaring, and I'm not really a fan of the original version of this film. But with Philip Glass's score, it definitely does help the film have an emotional beat to it. It helps it continually have some sort of spirit. And I thought that Philip Glass's music was just mesmerizing and haunting and fit the film really well, and definitely did elevate the movie and made it resonate in a way that I think it just wasn't able to without that score. But that's just my personal opinion. I know some people feel that the original version is still the version to go with, and Philip Glass's score is interesting and it does fit the film well, but it it sounds too contemporary, and it doesn't really feel like it fits the time period. But all of that being said, yes, it might not really fit the time period that well in terms of the instruments that were used and so on, but it just fits the vibe and the feel of the film so well that it just makes the movie so much more immersive and intriguing, because there's that extra added layer to it that just wasn't there without Philip Glass's score. But that's just me personally. But anyway, I don't really know what else to say about Dracula from 1931 except I definitely would recommend it if you haven't seen it yet, because it is a film that's very important, and it's a film that I think everybody should watch at least once if they are a fan of the horror genre, just to kind of see the beginnings of this genre, and to see where it started, and to see where the ground was initially paved. But anyway, that's my review of Dracula. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later. See ya.